Recently, I left my paperwork with my esteemed colleague here, and I travelled to the picturesque Essex market town of Saffron Walden to interview Sir Alan Haselhurst M.P. about the role of the Commonwealth in Botswana and in Africa more widely. Sir Alan, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed today and for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Okay.
You've been the Member of Parliament for the Saffron Walden constituency since 1977.
Correct, yeah.
That's an amazing 37 not out by my reckoning. And in 2010 you became chairman of the UK branch of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association.
Yeah.
Now I'd like to talk to you about the Commonwealth today. So I wondered if we could start with you. Could you please give me sort of a brief synopsis of the history of the Commonwealth and maybe just explain how the organisation came into being?
Well, I mean, the Commonwealth, whether you will call it an organisation or not, I'm not sure. It's an association of friends, almost a family. That term is often used about the Commonwealth family of nations. It quite clearly emerged from the British Empire, and as states became independent in the post-war period, they were of their own accord pleased to be still associated with the United Kingdom in what then became an expanding body of countries, for a while known as the British Commonwealth, but quite properly after a while simply the Commonwealth. The English language was quite a useful part of the glue, as it were, which held these nations together. But as a result of history, there were certain sort of common values, if you like, that were there. And sometimes the basis of administration, which British rule had put in place, and that has developed, of course, in different ways since then. So there was a familiarity which kept people together, and they began to see advantages in that. And over the years, in fact, countries which were not part of the British Empire have sought to join. So we have a country like Mozambique, Rwanda, for example.
And they're the two countries who've joined most recently, aren't they?
That's right.
And I mean, thinking about the modern Commonwealth, that as we know it now, it really came into being in 1949, didn't it?
Technically, yes.
And thinking of the historical context, of course at this time Britain was a quickly declining power on the international stage and really virtually bankrupt after standing up against Nazi Germany in the Second World War. So, I mean, I put it to you, was the creation of the Commonwealth really little more than a political fig leaf, sort of to protect British vanity in the face of the disintegration of the empire?
Well, I think there was the feeling of continuity, that there were the Commonwealth countries, as they became, had all been important markets for British goods. But what was not fully realised at the time was that simply made in England or made in Britain was not in itself a good enough recommendation, because these countries were making their own economic advances. As markets grew in the Commonwealth countries, naturally they began to look at what they were going to make for themselves and no longer rely on imports, whether from Britain or from indeed any other part of the world. So it never struck me at the time that this was essentially a trading organisation. But in terms of wanting to sustain British influence throughout the world, well, what country wouldn't wish to maintain its influence? So undoubtedly there was an advantage in keeping a thread between all these countries as they emerged from colonial rule into independence, in a sort of friendship group, from which indeed Britain didn't do it for altogether altruistic reasons, but nevertheless saw it as a means of consolidating opinion based on certain traditions.
Okay, and bringing it up to date, you've mentioned the values shared by the 53 independent states of the modern Commonwealth. What exactly does the Commonwealth do specifically in Africa?
Well, what one has to think about is not just that there are meetings of heads of government where they try to find a accord on certain things, or that there are frequent interchanges of parliamentarians and through the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, courses, seminars, all about the practice of good governance in all sorts of ways. The Commonwealth has also spawned something like 90 organisations covering all different features of life. Business, there's a Commonwealth Business Forum, for example. There is a local government forum. There is an education forum. There are medical connections. There are telecommunications connections. You name it. There is probably some organisation where the Commonwealth name means that it's a grouping of like-minded people in whatever sphere within the Commonwealth. So it does an awful lot of things at micro level. It knits across in all sorts of ways without being, shall we say, a totally unified force.
Well, thank you for outlining sort of some of the interesting things that are done then in Africa. Returning to the core values shared by these nations with the Commonwealth Charter, is the Commonwealth Charter not sort of just an aspirational document? I mean, is there not a bit of an awkward dichotomy at the heart of the organisation where there are member states that have, shall we say, a less than perfect human rights record?
Well, I'm afraid that is true. And there are some issues which there are countries in the Commonwealth just have very strong feelings about, and which they, if you like, do not regard in the same way as we do as a human rights issue. The whole treatment of gay people, for example, divides Africa bitterly. Some of the liveliest debates I've attended within Commonwealth circles have been on that issue. And strangely, perversely almost, some of the values which are held on to tenaciously by many African countries on this subject, probably their views stem from the days of British missionaries telling them what was right and what was wrong. So it comes a bit rich when those who taught them have changed their mind and have a different attitude to these matters, are then enraged when their erstwhile sort of partners or colonial countries haven't changed their mind as well. But so it is quite a difficult one. But what do? There will be disagreements in families. You can't get everybody to agree, just as there is no unanimity of opinion within the 28 nations which form the European Union. Why should one expect there to be a unanimity of opinion between the 53 nations of the Commonwealth? But over time, you may get assimilation of views, and I don't think you can sort of by simply a declaration say, well, everything from now on changes and we're all thinking alike on the same subject. We all have exactly the same interpretation of human rights. But you just go on working at it. Zimbabwe is not currently a member of the Commonwealth. So there will be times when something happens which is just so much a breach of what we would profess to believe in commonly amongst ourselves. I think it's only through continued discussion, continued familiarisation with each other's views on things that one can actually start to move things along.
And thinking more specifically about Botswana, in what ways do you think that country has benefited from embracing some of the core values of the Commonwealth?
Well, I think it largely has. I mean, I think it probably stands above many of its neighbours within the continent of Africa.
But there's a lot of hope in Botswana, isn't there? I mean, it's had a great economic history in modern times. It's sort of grown faster than many of the other.
Well, it has quite a respectable increase in GDP, there's no doubt about that.
And stable governance through democracy.
Stable government through democracy, although there's not been any actual change of government. I think this is always one of the maturing features of the democracy, as to at which point you, somebody completely different, as it were, has a bloodless democratic change of power.
Rather than dynastic rule sort of for
yes,
want of a better term.
I think that those who have led the campaign for independence in many of the countries, Africa and beyond, cling on, as it were, because they feel they are owed respect from their peoples, because they were the ones who fought the hardest and most prominently for independence. But that doesn't necessarily lead to forever to a healthy democratic structure. But stability is very important. Stability is important for the people, stability is important for foreign investment, and for the confidence which people have in the systems which apply in any country. And I think Botswana has a very respectable record in that respect.
And indeed, stability is also, of course, important for tourism.
Completely.
Have that to get visitors in.
That is so.
And do you think, though, that the smaller African member states get a lot more political clout than they otherwise would without being part of the Commonwealth? Is the organisation sort of a leveller on the international stage? For example, does, say, Swaziland gain more from being a member than South Africa, for example?
Well, I think if you're a small country at the table with the larger ones, yes, your head of state or your prime minister, whatever your constitutional structure is sitting alongside, and with those from the bigger and supposedly more powerful countries, and they will often get their turn, as it were, in holding the chairmanship of a regional grouping or whatever it may be, or in the Pan-African Parliament and so on. All sorts of little positions that one may come your way, and that's a good thing. They have parity of esteem, and I think that is the important thing to hang on to.
And would you say that the Commonwealth is purely a diplomatic or political organisation, or is there really a huge relevance at grassroots level for sort of ordinary Africans?
I'm not sure how much relevance day to day, when you talk of grassroots, would be felt. I think if you walked out into the street in Saffron Walden or in London and asked the first 10 people you met, what is the meaning of the Commonwealth to them, there might be a few ums and ers and so on. So in the depths of Africa, in the heartland of India, you would find similarly some uncertainty about what it's all about, and so the Commonwealth brand is quite difficult to sell as such until you begin to explain what happens. And when you mention what is the meaning of the Commonwealth, I mean, I would say by reference to all these organisations which exist, the 90 or so organisations covering a whole spectrum of different interests which do exist within the Commonwealth. So you are getting people thinking in Commonwealth terms in their respective trade, profession, or whatever it may be. So there is meaning radiating out. And whilst it's not been a trading organisation because their needs of countries were pulling in different directions, funnily enough now it is starting to adopt a sort of stronger position in trading matters. So the trading aspect is becoming more interesting, and maybe it's also values as well, that there are forms of dealing which are accepted across the Commonwealth in which people have reliance. And it's interesting that in the case of Botswana, I think 75% of trade is done with other Commonwealth countries, and a substantial part of it with the United Kingdom. So yes, the Commonwealth has a meaning, but it can't just be done on sentiment. I mean, sentiment's good, but you've actually got to be able to say, well, yes, if you trust somebody, nevertheless have I got a product or a service that they would want to purchase, and vice versa. So yes, I think the Commonwealth is a concept which has a meaning. They think, well, these countries have respect for a lot of the sort of commercial law and so on. Now, on the bad side, there is fears of corruption. It's interesting, therefore, that Botswana has been host to a sort of anti-corruption drive in which the Commonwealth Secretariat has invested money and so on. So Botswana, I think, can claim, certainly in relation to many, that it has got pretty clean hands.
Well, that's very positive news. And so finally, what role do you see the Commonwealth playing in, say, 15 to 20 years' time? Do you think the organisation has a bright future on the continent?
Yes, I do. It's got a long way to go. You referred to the aspirational nature of the Charter. So, yes, there are those who need to improve their performance in terms of human rights in whatever sphere, and to ensure that there is a proper system of governance in which people have confidence. What worries me about developing countries is that you can't necessarily satisfy as quickly as people would want their own personal aspirations. Now, I look at a country like South Africa, where there are many more millions of people that are living in Botswana, but there are still a huge proportion of people in South Africa who are living in dire poverty, who must have supposed that once true independence had been achieved in South Africa with majority rule, that things would suddenly get better. And it takes time for things to get better. So it's a matter of whether people feel that they can express themselves other than by violence. And that means confidence in your parliamentary system, whether as someone who has strong views and an ambition, they should look to get into Parliament to express that view, to influence other people within their own country, rather than just give up and say, well, the only way is to continue some kind of armed struggle or insurrection and so on. Now, there's some pretty bad situations in parts of Africa, not all of them Commonwealth countries, at the present time. And so one wants to see stability, and this is what Botswana certainly can boast at the present time and may long continue. People have confidence in the system, and as the years go by, those systems mature and people become more relaxed about the fact that there could be a constitutional change of power from going from one party to another and so on. So all those are signs which give confidence to the people and also confidence to those who trade with the country, deal with the country, as to, well, yes, this is a place that I want to back, and it's a place where I would encourage the development of a tourism industry, and so on.
Well, so a positive future ahead. So Alan, thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
Thanks.